the question pulled last time. There was one thing that I maybe didn't emphasize enough, and that's that I do take plagiarism extremely seriously, and so does our department. I mean, the way plagiarism was treated at the University of Virginia, a school that had a very serious honor code, was that it was an honor violation. And if a student accused another student because they knew of a case of plagiarism and it was confirmed and there was an honor trial, there was only one penalty for that, and that was banishment from the university for life. So that'll give you an idea of how seriously it was taken there. I'm not looking for a gotcha moment. I told you this when we were going over the things. I'm not looking to catch somebody in some little technical case of plagiarism. Oh, you quoted twice in the same paragraph and you only cited one of them or something like that. And I understand that for these, for the test essays, there's a lot of already understood things that you're taking information from your textbook and or my PowerPoints. But, so I mean, you don't have to be afraid that you're going to make some little slip up and it's going to cost you zero. And that is what the penalty for plagiarism is. If you plagiarize an essay and I catch it, you get a zero for that essay, even if it's a 100-point term paper, and the math just works out the way it does with the rest. But there is no opportunity to rewrite a plagiarized essay, because people just take that into account as part of their cost-benefit analysis, as part of their risk-reward calculations. There's nothing but a downside if I catch you. And so the kind of thing that will get you a zero in my class is remember, when you don't cite a source, the understanding, or put something in quotation marks, the understanding is that this is your work. These are my words. And when you don't attribute something to something else, it's understood that you're passing it off as your own. And that's very serious. You say, well, it's not as, okay, so the point is, what will get you to zero is an essay that is substantially cut and pasted from other sources or another source. I wish I had invested money in it, because I learned about Google from my colleagues at Hartford Community College in the 1990s, when their stock was probably really cheap, because they said, of all the search engines out there, that's the best place to hunt for plagiarized stuff. But there's other ways too. Usually takes me less than 2 minutes to find a plagiarized essay out there on the internet, to find where it was plagiarized from. If it takes me 3 to 5 minutes, I'm really slipping. So remember, none of us got our advanced degrees from teaching. We all got our advanced degrees as researchers. And trying to pass something off onto a trained researcher is like trying to heckle a nightclub comic. You are way out of your league. But you can try, but you've been warned, okay? So, having started out negatively, let's get to some of the positive stuff. The allegory, there'll doubtless be some questions on it. Remember that, the prisoners are down there in the cave, and the prisoners represent us. So somebody still didn't know where the heck this thing was. Look, you click course documents, and you can see the PowerPoint folder, the question pool folder, supplementary readings if you haven't bought the text yet are there. But then there's a handouts folder, and there's a Crito handout that we're going to look at some. And there are two Crito handouts. There's a summary of the arguments, and that's what I put in your review sheet. But then there's this handout on the meanings of the allegory of the cave. Don't worry about the stuff I did on the nature of philosophy. I'm not going to test you on. We went over that at the very beginning. It was just a way of kind of easing you into it. So you've got this handout, and these are the items in the cave. These two right-hand columns illustrate the two different ways of interpreting it. One as a story about the critical function of philosophy, and again, please put away your phones if you still have them out. How philosophy gets us to confront and challenge and critically reflect on our culturally acquired beliefs. And the other column has to do with Plato's theory of reality, the theory of the forms. And remember, we went over a PowerPoint on that, on the forms, and there are also some recorded lectures on all of these. And if you haven't gotten familiar with Blackboard yet, you're really doing yourself a significant disservice, because more and more we rely on that. So the critical function of philosophy, and Plato meant it to be interpreted this way because he meant it to be a story about how Socrates was forcing his fellow Athenians to examine the beliefs they had acquired in their own cultural environment. So the cave in this interpretation stands for the cultural environment that we have grown up in. For Socrates and his fellow Athenians, it would have been the cultural environment of ancient Athens. For us, it's different. And of course, we acquire beliefs. The prisoners, of course, are supposed to be us. And the prisoners are there, as the review sheet says. What are they wearing? Well, they're chained, right? And their vision is limited to the wall in front of them, on which they see continuously changing shadows of objects that are carried by people in back of them in front of a fire. Now, we went over this in detail. So the prisoners are to be like us, not in the sense that Plato thinks we all have been down in a cave at one point, but because, like the prisoners, we have grown up, we've sort of been chained into a particular cultural environment. And the prisoners experience only the shadows, and they've formulated beliefs from their environment about what the shadows are, and for them the shadows are the most real things. And we talked about this when we went over the essay question on that. So just like the prisoners, from many, many sources, we have soaked up and just assumed to be true many beliefs from our family, from our early schooling, from textbooks we've read, from our religious upbringing, from electronic sources like films, the internet, and the point is, there are a lot of views that we've come to accept uncritically as true, just like the prisoners in the cave uncritically accept what they have experienced as true. And Socrates saw this about his ancient Athenians, and he thought some of their beliefs needed challenging. They needed a gadfly, they needed a horsefly to come along and sting them and wake them up to the fact that they need to reflect more on their fundamental beliefs about things. So when we talk about the shadows as being what our unreflective beliefs are about, our unreflective beliefs then are the ones that we've simply assumed true by osmosis from our environment without really thinking much about them or raising a question. And philosophy asks us to confront these things. And you see a story of that in pages 10 through 13 of your text. Your author talks about the fact that somebody, say, has picked up a certain set of religious beliefs from their upbringing, and they come to college, and a lot of people have different religious beliefs, and they're forced to confront the reasons why they hold the beliefs that they do, and to examine them. And I said before, in the real world, Plato's analogy breaks down because philosophy may not always have us reject some of these beliefs we've grown up with. In other words, some of the beliefs that we have are going to withstand philosophical sifting and scrutiny, and you may even find from reading some of the philosophers we've studied in the course that you find better reasons for some beliefs you already have than the ones you had before. In Plato's analogy, though, all of the prisoners in the cave are simply wrong about the shadows being the most real things. And they should jettison all of those beliefs. So the items casting the shadows then are where we get our beliefs from. The released prisoner, of course, represents the person who's confronted to think philosophically about their beliefs. You can call this the philosophy student. And the prisoners remaining in the cave are the people who don't want to think, who just want to uncritically accept what they've always believed. And that was, Martin Luther King, remember, said he wants to be like a gadfly in his own society, which is a big old horsefly. Socrates says, look, my fellow Athenians are just so self-content, in their own viewpoints and thinking they're right just by osmosis, that he says, they're like a big old horse out in the field on a sunny day, and what they need is a big old horsefly to come along and sting them and wake them up. And Martin Luther King said in that letter we read from a Birmingham jail that that's what he thinks his function is in what was then segregationist American society in the South, to challenge people about their uncritically accepted beliefs regarding, in that environment, segregationist laws. So the released prisoner's guide then is a person who takes somebody on a philosophical journey, and that's what the journey up out of the cave is supposed to represent, a journey where we examine critically our beliefs and the reasons for them and our most fundamental concepts. So here, the world outside the cave would represent the world of knowledge, the world that of beliefs that are actually supported by good reasons, and that we have good reasons to accept. In other words, our philosophically sifted belief are what are the objects outside the cave. Well, so that's the interpretation illustrating the critical function of philosophy, but we also said Plato wants his story to have a more technical side, a more technical meaning, illustrating his two worlds theory of reality. And so as the story relates to Plato's view of the forms, you know, you have to realize that everything inside the cave represents everything in what's called the sensible world, the world you and I live in, the world that our senses put us in touch with. That's the cave in Plato's story. The prisoners, again, are us, and like Madonna, we don't have a choice. We are material. We're all material boys and girls in the material world, right? You know, I don't have a choice about whether I'm a material being in the material world. You know, we're chained, right, there. And so the cave, then, where the prisoners are, represents this world. The shadows are images of things in this world. And they don't just represent shadows, but for Plato, any images are less real. And this is something you have to understand about Plato's way of looking at things. For us, either Socrates lived or he didn't. Either he's real or he didn't, or he's not. Unicorns are either real or they're not. You know, there's no middle ground for us. Something is either real or it's not. But for Plato, there's a continuum of reality, and on the lowest rung are images of things, of material things in this world. Not only shadows, but reflections in a mirror or in water, or a created image, like a painting. All of those, Plato says, are less real than the objects that they're images of. And so that's what the shadows would represent. The objects that are casting the shadows carried by people would represent material things in this world that cause images. So for Plato, those objects are more real than the shadows, but you know, we saw that for him they're not the most real things. Plato is going to try to convince us that there's an unseen realm of eternal standards for things, and things in that world exist more fully than anything in this world. Why? Because things in this world are constantly changing. This is the world of becoming. Things are in a constant state of becoming something else. They're never stably what they are. But in ultimate reality, for Plato, things have to be stable. And so while particular triangles can come and go in this world, the form of triangularity for him is eternal. And it has characteristics that are eternally true of something like a triangle. And he thinks that there are ultimate standards for things like moral goodness, justice, and what have you, in this other realm. So inside the cave, then, the objects the people are carrying represent material objects. And like the prisoners in the cave, we grew up in the material world And we tend to think, says Plato, that things like this, these objects that we can see, feel, touch, taste, whatever, we tend to think they're the most real things. That a desk, like the ones you're sitting on, are the most real things, but Plato says no. Those desks come and go. They're in the world of becoming. They're not as real as an ultimate standard for what a desk is, that he says is in the world of the forms. So again, this is a way of thinking about what exists and what is real that we're not used to, right? And especially when we think of abstract objects, we think of them as imaginary objects, as having less reality than these kinds of things. Whereas Plato's going to try to convince us that the eternal standard for a triangle or the eternal standard for a desk has more reality because it exists eternally and it's unchanging than any particular thing in this world. So the fire inside the cave, here's where it gets tricky. Again, I'm going through this fast, one, because I'm recording it. You can always play it back slower. But also, we've gone over this before. Yeah, it's louder than you think back there. Okay. The thing is, the fire inside the cave, well, if everything in the cave represents what's in this world, this material world, then what gives light and heat to things in this material world? The sun. So the fire in the cave represents the sun. Yeah.
So I have a question about that, right? About number 4 and particularly, I'm asked to...
Well, okay. Well, why don't you hold that till the end then, instead of getting us off? Is number 4 about this?
It's similar, yes.
I mean, I don't have them memorized in order.
So, if Socrates gives a reason for not retailing against the state, even upon his wrongly, that he is not on equal footing with him, as the child is not on equal footing with a parent or a slave with his or her master. In your opinion, would Martin Luther King have accepted Socrates' reason on this point for enduring an unjust punishment? So, to give reasoning for this, I compared Martin Luther King's actions of his time to 2 other civil rights era leaders, and showed their 2 reasonings on how they handle it and why they are different from Socrates, and also went back to Martin Luther King, and I showed how he agreed with it by comparing.
Well, okay. I mean, something like that would work. You know, you're bringing in more than is required, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's relevant to the discussion. Yeah, so that it sounds like you're in good shape on doing that. Okay, so the fire represents the sun in this world. Obviously, the released prisoner is a person taken on a journey, a philosophical journey. In this case, it's a journey toward understanding what's genuinely real. And, of course, in Plato's story, the released prisoner has to jettison all of his beliefs, the ones he acquired inside the cave about what's most real, because the shadows are twice removed from reality for Plato. They're not as real as the objects in the cave casting them, and they're not as real as the form. So we saw the prisoner gets out of the cave, and folks, please don't talk. You know, even with these acoustic tile ceilings, sound travels like crazy. I mean, I have had people in the front row complain to me as a professor in other classes that I don't do enough to shut up people in the back row because they can't hear what's being said and they find it distracting. So that's why I'm saying stop it. All right, so the point is this is supposed to represent a journey from opinion and jettisoning false opinions to knowledge. And the guide of the prisoner represents a philosophy teacher, but also specifically was a sideways reference to Socrates. When the prisoners back down there in the cave say, look, this journey has ruined the guy's eyesight when he comes back down in the cave. If you try to take me on a similar journey, I'm going to kill you. Don't do it. Plato's writing this after the trial and death of Socrates, and he knows people in Athens who read this are going to see it as a sideways reference to Socrates as the teacher. So the journey represents this journey toward knowledge for Plato. The world outside the cave, then, everything outside the cave represents for Plato the world of true reality, the world of the forms, the world where these changeless, eternal standards for things exists. And these for him are the objects of genuine knowledge. Now, when we look at Aristotle, see, Plato had forms in things too. In other words, there was an eternal form for what a desk is in the world of the forms, but in every particular desk, that desk was a combination of a perfect form and imperfect matter. So there was a sense in which there were forms in things for Plato as well. For Aristotle, he questioned the existence of this separate world, this world outside the cave. For Aristotle, there were only forms in things. Now, where that becomes particularly of value here when we think about Aristotle's ethics is looking at what the sun in the outside world represents for Plato. Because you might say, well, wait a second, if the fire in the cave represents the sun, what on earth does the sun represent? Well, the sun represents Plato's highest form. He calls it goodness itself. The ultimate standard for moral goodness is what it is for Plato. He calls it the form of the good with a capital G. And so that's what the sun in the outside world represents. And so for Aristotle, there is no separate world of the forms. And by logical deduction, there is no form of the good in any separate world. So when Aristotle looks for an ultimate good in ethics, he can't look for some eternal standard in another unseen realm. Instead, Aristotle looks towards something in this world, which turns out to be eudaimonia, human happiness and well-being. So, okay, so back to the review sheet. Again, we're going before going to Aristotle, and he asked me about some of this. Again, folks, I am not looking for you to be able to summarize an argument in philosophy like you see it here. This, yes, he can try. There's nothing wrong, but there's more going on here than you know in terms of how these are structured. This takes a lot of training, and it takes more training than you would get even if you took a logic course here. But it's a way of getting out the central points of Socrates' argument. We already mentioned when we went over this question that his friends come to him saying you should make your decision based on public opinion. And Socrates rejects this. We saw he gives the analogy of a trainer, that an Olympic athlete could do something to harm their bodies if they listened to public opinion. rather than to an expert, to their trainer. And so Plato has Socrates say, well, look, in a moral matter like this, where we could damage not our bodies but our souls by making the wrong moral decision, we ought to listen to the views of an expert. And who's the expert here? Well, it turns out to be Socrates himself. And so his friends, we saw the arguments they present, that Socrates should worry about public opinion as regards his friends, people thinking they're not good friends, not trying to get him out of jail. Socrates, please stop talking. How many times do I have to tell you? Is this second grade? Am I all of a sudden, did I just wake up and I'm in a second grade classroom instead of a college classroom? Or am I still in a college classroom? I don't know. You know, folks, I could make a heck of a lot more money by teaching K through 12 than I do as an adjunct professor in college. And there are reasons why I don't do that, and I knew 40 years ago why I made that decision. You know, and that's part of the reason. You know. Okay, let's go back. And it's never personal, folks. But, you know, when I see that you're doing things that ultimately are going to undermine your possibilities for success, you know, sometimes I'll jump in and intervene. Because, folks, there's a reason why 16 to 19% of the people who start walk across 4 or 5 years later, you know, and pick up a diploma, you know. And you want to ask yourself, am I going to be part of that 16 to 19%? You know, and what do I need to do in order to achieve that? And folks, if you say, well, yeah, but still, I've had some college. But listen, go look at the statistics for how well people do out there in the real world, and the difference between actually having that degree in hand and just having had some college. You know, there is a huge difference. Anyway, let's get back to this. So Socrates says, look, I'm not going to listen to public opinion. I'm going to make my decision here the way I've always made it, by weighing the reasoning on both sides of the issue and by coming down on the side that seems to have the best reasons in its favor. You know, and so his friends say, not going to cost us much money to bribe the guards. Socrates, you have young children. Wouldn't you want to be around to see them educated? But Socrates says, let's look at the moral things that are relevant here. And one, he views the state as if it were almost an individual person who can be harmed. And so Socrates says, if I escape, I would harm the state by overturning the verdict of its courts. Remember, he could have proposed exile, he didn't. He proposed that non-penalty of a state pension, free meals in the state dining hall, the Prytaneum. The jury voted for the prosecutor's penalty, but he says, after that's already happened, I would be overturning what the laws said, the whole legal system, the verdict of the courts, to accept my friend's offer to bribe the jailers and get me out of jail. And so he says, I would harm the state. So he says, any state would be harmed if the verdicts of its courts and its laws were overthrown at will by private citizens. And I mean, you could take a real trivial example. Suppose tomorrow morning everybody who drives in Baltimore City decided, the heck with waiting on these red lights. That's an inconvenience. I'm just going to go through them whenever I feel like it. Well, things would be chaos, you know, and so that's the kind of thing that Socrates is getting at. That so he looks at the state as an entity that can be harmed, and he says, look, here's this moral principle that we oughtn't to go around harming other people with no reason, and he says, I'd harm the state if I escape, so he says I shouldn't escape. He also says that,
So these arguments, whatever, at the bottom of the review sheet, is this what is going to be on the test? Like, are we just going to read this and have to interpret it, or?
Well, I may ask questions that relate to the basic points in these arguments. I'm not going to ask you to repeat one of these or something. And actually, you raise a point that Friday, the first thing we're going to do is go through a sheet of about 10 or so sample questions that'll give you an idea of how I would ask an objective question. I may even put it up on Blackboard this afternoon, but we'll go over that Friday, and you'll get an idea of how I might ask something like this. But I'm not asking you all to be able to follow and repeat all this. Remember, this is true, false, multiple choice. But there may be some questions that have to do with how Socrates makes his decision and the reasons for it. So at any rate, real quickly, his other two arguments are that the state has been like a parent to him. It enables his own parents to get married. The laws of the state did. It's raised him, educated him. Socrates says the state being like a parent, he should not disobey a parent. And also a child is not on the same level as a parent in that it is justified in striking back at the parent even if the parent punishes him unjustly. So Socrates says, even if I'm in here unjustly, I shouldn't strike back. And I ask you to think about that vis-a-vis Martin Luther King, because he doesn't seem to have the same sort of view toward the state. So Socrates says he'd disobey a parent if he escaped, and so he shouldn't escape. Also, when people sign for a mortgage on a home or a big legal contract, they get together in a table and everybody signs documents. That's not the way Socrates sees himself, as having a contract, an understood agreement with Athens to obey its laws. But it is exactly that. It's an understood agreement. When I was growing up during the Cold War era, there was barbed wire and machine guns separating communist East Germany from the free West Germany, and it was worth your life to try to escape to freedom in the West. Socrates' Athens was not communist East Germany during the Cold War. Socrates was free to leave anytime he wanted to. And he says, because I could have left at any time if I didn't like the way the court system conducted it itself and the way the laws were written in Athens, but I didn't leave, he says, because I voluntarily stayed here. And he was in Athens most of his life, except for being a soldier in the Peloponnesian War. He says, I have an understood agreement to obey the laws and respect the verdicts of the courts, and I would be breaking this agreement. So he says I would be breaking my moral responsibility to keep my agreements. Now again, does he have an agreement to be there if he's, convicted unjustly as he believes? Well, okay. To Aristotle, yes, Aristotle's kind of elitist, but he's in line with Plato and Socrates before him in elevating reason. The Greeks thought that the rational part of us, the part that understands complex concepts, the part that can follow an argument or create an argument, the part that can understand our moral responsibility, that part of us they thought was divine, was the closest thing to the gods. And being like the gods, they thought that reason or the rational part of us should rule over the rest of us if we're going to be truly moral people. And also Aristotle thinks that reason is the chief characteristic that we as humans have. Now I told you that's a very controversial view that some people have even today, but it raises questions tying our humanity to our rationality, But Aristotle does this, and so he's not unique. And we saw he thinks that we should pursue intellectual virtues. That is, we should be curious about our world theoretically, but we were looking at Aristotle's views on ethics, many of which people think are still viable today. Even though he might be wrong with tying reason to humanity, he still says a lot of things about the nature of virtues as character traits that have survived over the years and have many advocates today. So he says we can develop moral virtues. We don't have to be born with them. And he sees moral virtues as virtuous character traits, and so did Socrates and Plato. And for him, they're acquired by habit over time, and sometimes contrary to what our lower impulses would be. But the idea is, if we're going contrary to nature, we're using our reason to enable us to do that. So he says their virtues are acquired over time like skills, and we saw he compares it to the skill a carpenter might have in building. These are skills they have to learn over time, or skill at playing a musical instrument like a lyre. And so he says we can develop virtuous character traits that way. We saw that for him, they're developed in society, and they're the mean between the extremes of excess and deprivation. So a lot of this I already went through when I discussed the question. If you have more questions about this, if you're going to write on it, you can send me an email. I took a little more time than I did explaining some things. So if somebody has some more questions about this next time, I can answer them at the beginning of the period. But otherwise, we'll start with, I'll give you some practice questions. I always do this for the first test. I don't do it for the other tests because for the second and third test, you've already seen how I would ask an objective question in philosophy. For the first test, you need to see how I would do that with practice questions. So we'll go over that. Remember to bring a number 2 pencil. Remember to bring your essay. Make sure it's on time. And again, do not plagiarize it. It's not worth the risk. I'm a pretty lenient essay grader, you know. So, you know, and so that'll be the only thing we do Monday. It'll be 30 questions. You'll be responsible for 25 times 2 points each. So there's an extra up to 10 points built in as a curve, you know. So it'll be 30 questions. Get your Scantron forms. I'm going to send you to the bookstore if you don't have one, and you'll lose time. You know, again, the bookstore sells them. They used to be 43 cents plus tax. Okay, I don't want to make you late for your next class. If anybody missed the roll, okay, bring it up here and sign it on your way out then if you haven't signed it. No, okay.
So the sample questions that you're going to have for us on Friday, it's going to be based off of the information from the review sheet?
Yeah.
Okay, and you said you're going to only give us like 10 questions?
Yeah, because I'll go over not just the answers to some of those, but what I do is I take a sampling of the types of questions and the way I would ask them, you know.
Okay.
You know, so I'll try to focus on that.
It just dawned on me. I'm not on Blackboard, so I don't have access to any of this information.
You're not on Blackboard.
Not as of yet.
Okay, do you have a smartphone? Because there is a Blackboard app that you can get
For your class?
from the Google Play Store. Well, the point is if you download the Blackboard app and sign on to it, it should bring up your
Classes.
courses. See,
Yeah, it
I've
brings
got
up my
one.
courses, but I'm not
Now,
assigned to you. I'm still assigned to Dr. Arthur.